This economy is right now reeling. The president is doing everything that one could imagine a president could do. There is stimulus. There are aggressive efforts to reopen this economy and to do so safely. At this juncture, we have an estimated 36.5 million people have been laid off over the past several months. Is it your judgment that we have seen joblessness at this rate, the rate peak?
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things we're seeing, Lou, is that businesses are gradually opening. We've got some real-time trackers that suggest that over the last month, the percentage of businesses that are open has gone up in the double digits. And so we are seeing an economy that's opening. But I would expect that especially the pockets of weakness will be weak for a little bit longer, and that we're going to see more big initial claims for unemployment insurance numbers, and probably an unemployment rate a month from now that's maybe a little bit north of 20%. But I think that, that's the second quarter. We know the second quarter is bad because we had to shut down to save millions of lives. And I think that we're just about trajecting up now. And by the third quarter, we expect that to happen sharply. And the fourth quarter and into next year, I think that we have every reason to agree with the Congressional Budget Office that we're going to have a very, very sharp recovery.
I'm just curious about how the White House feels, the president feels, about having idiots in Congress doing things about expediting, Pelosi wanting to expedite foreign workers into this country in the medical field, when, as I just reported, we've had 130,000 lose their jobs in hospitals alone in the midst of this damn pandemic. What kind of idiocy is at large in the swamp on Capitol Hill? This is becoming obscene.
It is very frustrating, Lou. I'm sure that you're right about that. But the one thing that I want to say behind the scenes, and I think you mentioned it in your story or your lines at the top, is that I think it's more about leadership than necessarily rank and file, because we've had a lot of very productive phone calls with, bipartisan phone calls with members, Democrats and Republicans, both the House and the Senate, over the last few weeks to think about what next policy steps we need to take in order to make sure that there's a strong jobs recovery for Americans. And so there are definitely Democrats out there that want to work with the president to help make the economy strong again. It's just that they appear not to be in leadership nor to even influence the decisions of leadership. And I think that's why you're seeing so much division in the House right now.
Yeah. They not only lack a voice, though, these Democrats that you find palatable, they don't have particular courage, that is, to stand up. We saw 14 of them today in a procedural vote. But this is, as I said, this has become an obscenity, what the Democratic Party, and particularly under Pelosi and Schumer, are doing on Capitol Hill. There are pockets of intelligence, rationality, and policy prescriptions out there among some of the states, but damn few. Let's turn to a part of this $3 trillion travesty. First of all, the number is an arrogant and disgusting, appalling approach to move through the House on the part of Pelosi. But a third of it to go to states, irrespective of their fiduciary responsibilities, their financial and economic stewardship, irrespective of their deficits, the calamity that is leadership in some of these major states. And one doesn't have to wait too long to mention Illinois, to mention New York State and others. We need to hear what the president's going to say about this and what the take is going to be, because, again, this is calamitous, what she is prescribing.
Well, Lou, I share your strong feelings about this. And the thing I can say is that if we, again, look at the Congressional Budget Office forecast, then they're projecting a decline in GDP for the year, even though it's going to be a strong second half. And if you just take their numbers and then think about, well, how much is state and local revenue going to go down, then it seems right now, looking at the numbers, that we've given them already in the first phases of the stimulus more money than the shortfall one would expect to see for the states. Now, there definitely, as you said, are going to be some states that have more trouble than others. But on average right now, I think we've given them more money this year than the shortfall that'll happen because of the weak economy, according to the Congressional Budget Office numbers. And so they really are trying to bail out states that have been having problems for years and years and years, and they're using this COVID emergency as an excuse, basically, for partisan politics.
Are you saying the president won't permit it come hell or high water?
I'm saying that the president has the #1 priority of creating jobs for Americans, and that he's watching the data closely, and that if there are more moves that we have to make, then we're going to try to do that, and we're going to need Democratic votes to do that. And so I think that, you know, we stand ready to negotiate moving forward, but it's going to be data-driven, not politics-driven.
You know, much like the deep state itself and the permanent bureaucracy, these are the kinds of compromise and appeasement of principle, and particularly what you all know is not a loyal opposition, but a party of hate that is trying to overthrow and continues to try to overthrow this president. This business as usual nonsense, I believe the American people have had it. And I would hope the president has had it. And I would hope those near him, counseling him, would understand that this is a special time for courage, for intellect, and originality of thought, rather than going along like baying hounds with the most radical part of the Democratic Party. So
you can count on that. You can count on that, Lou. You can count on that.
I appreciate that, and I know nearly all Americans do as well, so thank you for that. Let's turn to right now this reopening and how important it is. The president has stood tall and has insisted that we behave as a strong superpower, a strong nation with strong people, and not a bunch of buttercups and daffodils, rather adults having to deal with an extraordinary crisis. But deal with it we must. Your thoughts about how quickly or how slowly, depending on your perspective, how long will it take us to get to something approaching, I would say, the return of vitality in what was an amazing age of prosperity stewarded by President Trump?
Right. Well, I think that it's going to happen a lot faster than some people think, and you can hear the president's taking off in a helicopter right now. But it's going to happen a lot faster than people think, because we came in January with the strongest economy ever, and so we took the biggest hit ever. But we're going to come back because of our fast-moving policies, I think, much faster than people think. And I think, again, that's consistent with what the Congressional Budget Office is saying, that it's looking for a very strong second half of the year and an even stronger next year. And I think that's very much consistent with the economics of the situation.
I talked with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin here last night, Kevin, and one of the things that is standing in front of us is moving money to the people who have the working men and women of this country and their families. We're hearing reports from, yes, admittedly, much of it fake news organizations, but we're hearing too many reports that hundreds of thousands of people are not getting the assistance for whatever reason that they desperately need. Is that going to be the priority of the administration and whatever legislation comes forward out of the House?
Right. Well, you know, the president was adamant that we get cash to Americans to help them make it through, to build a bridge to the other side. And, you know, we mailed out north of 180 million checks to ordinary Americans all across the country to help finance them. And so now what we have to do is we have to watch the economy as it turns on and see if the bridge to the other side is complete. And I got to tell you that the early numbers that we're looking at in real time are really, for me, surprising how quickly they're moving. The businesses are opening up, people are getting back to work, and they're also doing so in a safe manner because of the steady guidance of the healthcare professionals. And so where I look at the states that are opening up the most, we aren't seeing increases right now in COVID cases that are remarkable. So I think that what's happening is we can open up.
What I asked about was moving that money into the hands of working men and women and their families, and making certain that you're flooding the zone, if you will.
Well, we did flood the zone, and we'll do it again if we need to, is all I want to say.
Well, I'm not talking about what you did. I'm talking about what you're doing and what the president acknowledges needs to be done yet. And if that's difficult to answer, I surrender, and we'll take it up next time.
There'll be another bill that'll be negotiated potentially, depending on if the economy needs.
That's always delight to my ears to hear a negotiated damn piece of legislation. But thank you anyway, Kevin. Great to have you here.